Silence arrived without warning, disguised as paperwork, and it landed on my doorstep like a polite threat. The HOA didn't shout, "Fine me loudly," or call the police. They did something worse. They erased my voice. One quiet rule, rarely mentioned and never explained, was suddenly used to ban me from meetings, block my emails, and label me non-compliant. No debate. No vote. Just silence. And they assumed I would accept it? I had lived in the neighborhood long enough to know how power really worked there. Questions were tolerated only until they became uncomfortable. I had asked why maintenance fees kept rising while repairs stalled. I had asked who approved emergency expenses that never seemed urgent. After that, conversations stopped. Smiles faded. Then the letter arrived, citing a quiet rule designed to protect community harmony. According to them, my curiosity was disruptive. At first, I doubted myself. The rule sounded official, wrapped in legal language and stamped with authority. Neighbors warned me to let it go. HOAs always win, one whispered. Another told me silence was cheaper than fighting. For a moment, fear worked exactly as intended. But something felt wrong. The rule was powerful, yet no one could explain where it came from. No one remembered voting on it. No one remembered seeing it enforced before. It existed only when needed, appearing suddenly like a switch flipped in the dark. So instead of arguing, I started reading. I pulled old bylaws, meeting minutes, archived notices, and dusty amendments from public records. I compared versions, dates, and wording. Patterns emerged. The rule didn't evolve naturally, it appeared fully formed, already weaponized. And every time it appeared, someone had been asking questions. I checked county filings, emailed clerks, and requested certified copies with dates attached. Responses arrived slowly, carefully worded, as if someone hoped I would lose interest. Instead, each delay sharpened my focus. I mapped timelines on my wall, tracing when the rule appeared and who benefited. Every arrow pointed inward. Board members rotated, but the outcome stayed the same. Dissent vanished. Fees climbed. Transparency shrank. That symmetry told me the rule wasn't protection, it was a filter, removing voices that threatened comfort. I kept digging anyway. What I uncovered next would connect documents, motives, and money, revealing why silence had been their most valuable asset inside. Then I noticed what everyone else missed. The rule depended on a specific approval process, buried in a footnote most people skipped. Without that step, the rule wasn't quiet at all. It was powerless. That realization changed everything. Because if the rule had no foundation, then the silence wasn't legal. It was manufactured. And if silence was manufactured, then someone was hiding something much bigger than my questions. That was the moment I stopped being afraid and started being dangerous. Once I understood that silence itself was the tool, not the consequence, everything around me started to look different. The smiles from board members felt rehearsed. The calm emails sounded scripted. Even the neighborhood newsletter suddenly read like propaganda. The quiet rule wasn't about harmony at all. It was about control, and control only works when people don't question the source of it. I focused on how the rule was triggered. Every enforcement followed the same pattern. A homeowner asked for records. A budget question was raised. A meeting grew uncomfortable. Then, suddenly, the quiet rule appeared, shutting the person out without confrontation. No shouting meant no witnesses. No argument meant no record. It was clean, efficient, and nearly invisible. I requested enforcement logs. The HOA responded with partial files, heavily summarized, missing attachments. Dates didn't line up. Some enforcement actions had no complaints attached, which violated their own procedures. Others referenced meetings that never appeared in official minutes. It felt less like poor record keeping and more like selective memory. So I widened my search. I spoke with former homeowners who had moved away. Patterns emerged again. People who challenged decisions didn't just lose their voice, many sold their homes within a year. Some felt pressured. Others felt isolated. A few admitted they left because fighting an HOA felt impossible. Silence didn't just end conversations. It pushed people out. Then I examined finances. That's where things became uncomfortable fast. Every time the quiet rule was enforced, fines followed shortly after. Administrative fees. Compliance costs. Restoration penalties. The language changed, but the timing didn't. Money flowed after silence, not before. Questions stopped, and expenses were approved without resistance. I created a timeline linking rule enforcement, fines, and budget approvals. The correlation was impossible to ignore. Large expenses consistently passed right after dissent disappeared. Vendors were paid quickly. Projects were rushed. Oversight vanished. Silence cleared the path. I brought this to an HOA committee member I trusted. He looked at the documents, went quiet, and slid them back to me without comment. The next day, he resigned. No explanation. Just gone. That confirmed my suspicion. This wasn't ignorance. It was awareness. Then I found the procedural checklist. A forgotten attachment referenced in the bylaws but never distributed publicly. It outlined how any rule affecting homeowner participation required verification before enforcement. That verification wasn't optional. It was mandatory. And it had never been completed. That checklist explained everything. Why the rule appeared suddenly. Why it was used sparingly. Why it vanished when questioned. It only worked when no one looked too closely. By then, I knew I wasn't dealing with a misunderstanding. I was dealing with a system designed to stay quiet by design. And systems like that don't collapse loudly. They collapse when light reaches the parts meant to stay hidden. The next step wasn't to accuse. It was to prove intent. And proving intent would require something the HOA never expected me to request. Proving intent meant going beyond what the HOA chose to share. Up to this point, everything I had found could still be dismissed as sloppy governance or administrative neglect. That excuse protected them. I needed something stronger. Something that showed the quiet rule wasn't just misused, but deliberately kept incomplete. And for that, I needed records the HOA didn't control. I filed formal requests with the county office responsible for recording HOA amendments and procedural approvals. Unlike the board, the county couldn't summarize or paraphrase. They had to provide certified copies exactly as filed. The waiting period felt endless. Weeks passed with no response, and during that time, the HOA suddenly became friendly again. Invitations to resolve things privately appeared in my inbox. Warnings about legal costs followed. The message was clear: stop looking. The county packet finally arrived on a Friday afternoon. It was thin. Too thin. Inside were stamped copies of every HOA amendment going back years. I spread them across my table, matching each one to the versions I already had. That's when the discrepancy became undeniable. The quiet rule amendment existed in HOA records, but the county version was missing critical validation pages. Entire sections referenced in the bylaws were never filed. One page mattered more than all the others. The approval certification. According to HOA rules, any amendment affecting homeowner participation required acknowledgement by an external authority and a recorded verification. That page was referenced repeatedly, but it wasn't there. Not missing by accident. Missing consistently. I contacted the county clerk directly. Her answer was simple and devastating. If it's not in our file, it was never approved. She explained that partial filings were sometimes submitted to meet deadlines, but enforcement was prohibited until verification was complete. The HOA never returned to complete it. That meant the quiet rule had never legally existed. Every enforcement, every fine, every removal of speaking rights, all of it rested on a rule that had no standing. Silence wasn't just unethical. It was unauthorized. I compiled the evidence carefully. County certifications, HOA versions, bylaw excerpts, timelines. I didn't share it publicly yet. I wanted one more thing, confirmation that the board knew. Because ignorance would soften consequences. Knowledge would destroy their defense. That confirmation came sooner than expected. Buried in old email disclosures was a message between two board members discussing the delay in final approval and agreeing it was safe to proceed quietly. That sentence removed all doubt. They knew. They enforced anyway. At that moment, the story changed. This was no longer about a homeowner silenced unfairly. It was about authority exercised without permission. Power borrowed from a rule that never legally stood. And once that truth existed on paper, the HOA lost the one advantage it relied on most, plausible denial. What followed next would force the issue into the open, whether they liked it or not. Once I had proof that the board knowingly enforced a rule that was never approved, the quiet pressure began. It didn't come as threats. It came as concern. Emails asking about my well-being. Suggestions that I might be misunderstanding legal language. Offers to talk things out privately for the good of the community. They weren't trying to fix the problem. They were trying to contain it. I refused private meetings and instead submitted a formal request to place an item on the agenda for the next open HOA meeting. The request was simple, a clarification of the quiet rule's legal status, supported by county records. They couldn't deny it without violating their own transparency requirements. The item was added, buried near the end of the agenda, scheduled after most residents usually left. They miscalculated. That meeting was more crowded than any I'd seen. Word spreads fast when people sense something is wrong. Homeowners who never attended before filled the room, standing along the walls, holding copies of documents I had quietly shared beforehand. The board members noticed immediately. Their usual confidence was gone, replaced by tight smiles and careful pacing. When the agenda item was called, the board president spoke first. He described the quiet rule as procedural and well-intentioned, avoiding any mention of approval or enforcement authority. He framed concerns as misunderstandings and assured everyone the rule existed to prevent disruption. Then he opened the floor. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I projected the county certified documents onto the screen. The missing approval. The incomplete filing. The requirement that enforcement was prohibited without verification. I read the clerk's statement aloud, slowly. Each sentence landed heavier than the last. The room changed. People began whispering, then questioning. One homeowner asked why she'd been fined under a rule that never legally existed. Another asked why he was barred from speaking at meetings last year. A third asked how many decisions were made after people were silenced. The board tried to regain control, calling for order, but order only works when authority is trusted. The meeting ended early. Not because questions were answered, but because the board adjourned abruptly for legal consultation. That night, emails flooded inboxes. Apologies. Clarifications. Promises to review enforcement actions. But the damage was done. Silence had failed publicly. Within days, a petition circulated calling for an independent review of all actions taken under the quiet rule. Signatures filled the pages quickly. Even homeowners who had once defended the board signed. Once people see proof, loyalty shifts fast. The HOA's attorney resigned the following week. That resignation spoke louder than any apology. It confirmed what many already suspected: this wasn't a mistake that could be corrected quietly. It was a breach that demanded exposure. And as outside attention began to grow, the board realized they weren't just facing angry homeowners anymore. They were facing consequences. The independent review began quietly, but its presence was felt immediately. Requests for documents multiplied. Deadlines replaced delays. The board was no longer deciding what could be seen or when. Every enforcement notice, fine, and restriction tied to the quiet rule was pulled for examination. What emerged wasn't chaos. It was consistency. Too much consistency to be accidental. The reviewers noticed that the same homeowners appeared repeatedly across unrelated disputes. Different questions, different years, same outcome. Silence. Each case file included the same language, the same justifications, and the same approvals. The rule had been used like a stamp, pressed down whenever resistance surfaced. It wasn't governance. It was conditioning. Financial reviewers joined next. They followed the timeline I'd already mapped, but with access I never had. Their findings confirmed it. Significant expenses were approved shortly after enforcement actions removed opposition. Emergency landscaping. Legal consultations. Consulting fees. The amounts weren't outrageous individually, but together they formed a pattern of convenience. Silence created speed. Speed avoided scrutiny. One reviewer asked a question that shifted the tone entirely: who benefited? The answer wasn't obvious at first. No one was buying yachts or draining accounts. Instead, the benefit was stability. Control. The ability to pass decisions without debate. In that environment, influence becomes currency. Favors replace process. And accountability quietly disappears. As interviews progressed, contradictions multiplied. One board member claimed the rule was rarely used. Records showed otherwise. Another insisted enforcement followed complaints. Many files had none. A third said approval was assumed. Assumption, it turned out, wasn't a legal defense. Homeowners were invited to submit statements. Stories poured in. People described being labeled difficult, isolated, and warned to think long-term. Some said they stopped attending meetings altogether. Others said they sold because fighting felt exhausting. Silence had reshaped the community, not through force, but fatigue. Then the reviewers uncovered something unexpected. Draft versions of the quiet rule existed before it ever appeared publicly. Internal notes discussed language choices, tone, and timing. One note suggested rolling it out only when needed. Another referenced avoiding attention by keeping enforcement administrative. These weren't the words of confusion. They were the words of planning. When those drafts were added to the report, the board's defense collapsed. Intent was no longer inferred. It was documented. The rule wasn't unfinished because of neglect. It was unfinished because completion would have triggered oversight. The final report concluded that enforcement under the quiet rule lacked authority, transparency, and compliance. Refunds were recommended. Decisions were flagged for reversal. And most importantly, governance changes were mandated to prevent repetition. The board's last remaining argument was that damage was minimal. But damage isn't measured only in money. It's measured in trust. And trust, once broken systematically, demands more than repair. It demands accountability. Accountability arrived slower than outrage, but when it came, it was unavoidable. The independent report triggered mandatory actions the board could no longer negotiate away. Enforcement under the quiet rule was officially suspended, and every decision connected to it was placed under review. That included fines, voting restrictions, meeting removals, and even contract approvals that passed during periods of enforced silence. The board's reaction was fractured. 2 members resigned within days, citing personal reasons. Another released a statement denying wrongdoing while stepping back from all responsibilities. Only one remained, insisting the report was overstated and that the community was overreacting. That stance isolated him quickly. Authority without support collapses fast. Refund notices were issued next. Not just for fines, but for fees labeled as administrative and compliance related. Seeing those checks arrive was surreal for many homeowners. Money mattered, but what mattered more was acknowledgement. The HOA was admitting, in writing, that it had overstepped. Supervised elections were scheduled to rebuild governance from the ground up. For the first time in years, candidates spoke openly without fear of consequence. People who had been silenced were now running for positions they never imagined holding. Campaigns weren't about power. They were about repair. During this transition, I was contacted by external advisors working with other communities. They wanted to understand how a quiet rule had operated undetected for so long. The answer was uncomfortable but simple. It worked because it didn't look like force. It looked like procedure. People obeyed because they assumed legality, not because they agreed. The remaining board member tried one final tactic. He proposed retroactive approval of the rule, arguing it would resolve technical gaps. That suggestion ended any remaining sympathy. Retroactive authority is an admission that authority was missing. Advisors shut it down immediately. What surprised me most was how quickly behavior changed once oversight appeared. Meetings became transparent. Documents were shared without resistance. Questions were answered directly. It proved what many had suspected all along. Silence had never been necessary for order. It was only necessary for control. As new board members took their seats, the quiet rule was formally removed from all governing documents. Not revised. Not replaced. Removed. Its absence felt symbolic. A space once used to suppress now served as a reminder. Still, consequences extended beyond the HOA. Former board members faced personal liability reviews. Insurance providers demanded policy changes. Vendors were re-examined. What started as one rule had exposed an entire culture of unchecked convenience. The community began to heal, but healing required memory. People wanted assurances that this couldn't happen again. That meant structural changes, not promises. And those changes would shape the final chapter of this story. Because rebuilding trust isn't about restoring what was lost. It's about creating something that can't be quietly taken away again. Rebuilding trust turned out to be harder than exposing the rule. Removing authority is fast. Repairing belief is slow. Even as new board members took control, many homeowners remained cautious, watching for signs that the same behavior might return under a different name. Transparency had to become more than a promise. It had to become structural. The first change was radical in its simplicity. Every rule, amendment, and enforcement action would now require a public reference file. If a homeowner asked, the documentation had to be produced within days, not weeks. No summaries. No interpretations. Just the source. The idea was clear: power should never depend on secrecy again. The second change addressed participation. Speaking rights could no longer be restricted by administrative labels. Only behavior during a meeting could be addressed, and only in that moment, with witnesses present. No retroactive silencing. No quiet exclusions. If someone disagreed, they stayed in the room. Disagreement was redefined as involvement, not disruption. As these changes rolled out, something unexpected happened. People began to engage again. Attendance increased. Questions grew sharper. Debates lasted longer. But instead of chaos, the result was clarity. Decisions took more time, but they carried legitimacy. Even those who lost votes felt heard. That alone reduced tension more than silence ever had. I noticed a shift in myself too. For months, I had operated in investigation mode, always looking for gaps, omissions, and patterns. Letting go of that vigilance wasn't easy. When power has been abused quietly, trust doesn't return just because rules change. It returns when behavior stays consistent over time. Former board members faded from view. Some avoided the neighborhood entirely. Others tried to reframe the past as a misunderstanding. But the community had moved on. Not with anger, but with memory. The story of the quiet rule became part of local history, retold not as gossip, but as a lesson. New homeowners were informed during orientation. Not to scare them, but to empower them. They were told exactly how governance worked, how to access records, and how to speak up. The quiet rule was explained as something that once existed and failed. That transparency alone made its return impossible. One evening, a homeowner who had sold years earlier reached out. She had followed the updates from afar and wanted to say something simple: "I wish this had happened sooner." That message stayed with me. Exposure doesn't just affect the present. It echoes backward, validating people who once thought they were alone. The community wasn't perfect now. No system ever is. But it was honest. And honesty creates resilience. Quiet control breaks easily once revealed. Open systems bend, but they don't snap. Looking around, I realized the rule had failed in its ultimate goal. It hadn't erased voices. It had trained people to listen more closely when things went quiet. And the final realization was this: silence only works when people believe it's permanent. Once they know it's constructed, it loses its power forever. As months passed, the absence of the quiet rule revealed something deeper than policy reform. It revealed how much fear had shaped everyday behavior without anyone noticing. People admitted they used to rehearse questions before meetings, deciding which ones were safe. Others confessed they avoided writing emails, worried a record might be used against them. Silence had trained caution into ordinary life. With the new structure in place, that caution slowly faded. Homeowners began requesting documents without apology. Financial reports were read closely, not out of suspicion, but responsibility. The act of participation itself became normal again. And once it did, the HOA lost its most dangerous weapon: intimidation disguised as order. External reviewers completed their follow-up inspections and issued a final assessment. The community was now compliant, transparent, and properly governed. But the report included a note that stood out. It stated that the original damage caused by the quiet rule was systemic rather than procedural. In simple terms, the problem wasn't just the rule. It was the mindset that allowed it to exist unquestioned. That realization shifted how people talked about authority. Instead of asking who was in charge, they asked how decisions were verified. Instead of trusting titles, they trusted processes. The difference was subtle but powerful. Authority was no longer assumed. It was earned continuously. I was invited to speak at a regional homeowner forum about what happened. Standing there, I realized how common the story was. Other communities had similar rules, different names, same effect. Quiet enforcement. Vague language. Administrative control. Many attendees took notes when I described the missing approval step, realizing they had never checked their own. What started in one neighborhood was now spreading as awareness. Not outrage. Awareness. That mattered. Outrage burns fast and fades. Awareness lingers. Back home, the HOA introduced one final safeguard. Any rule affecting homeowner rights would automatically expire unless reaffirmed through a transparent process. Silence could no longer sustain power over time. It had an expiration date. That rule alone changed the future. It ensured that no authority could rely on neglect or fatigue. Participation became built into survival. If people didn't engage, the rule disappeared. It flipped the old model completely. Looking back, the quiet rule had relied on one assumption: that people preferred peace over truth. What it never accounted for was curiosity. Curiosity doesn't shout. It reads. It compares. It waits. And when it finds gaps, it doesn't need permission to keep going. I thought about the moment I almost stopped. The day fear nearly worked. The outcome could have been very different. Silence would have held. The rule would still exist. And no one would know. Instead, one person kept reading. And in doing so, changed how an entire community understood power. Only one chapter remained. Not about exposure or reform, but about what silence teaches once it's broken, and why it never truly returns the same way again. The quiet that followed everything was different from the silence that started it all. This quiet wasn't enforced. It wasn't fearful. It was reflective. The community had learned how easily power could hide behind procedure, and that knowledge changed how people listened when things grew calm. Silence was no longer comforting by default. It became a signal to pay attention. At the final annual meeting of the year, attendance was higher than ever. Not because people expected conflict, but because participation had become habit. Reports were presented openly. Questions were asked without hesitation. Disagreements happened respectfully, in public, where they belonged. The room felt balanced, not controlled. That difference mattered. One homeowner stood up and said something simple that captured everything. I used to think staying quiet kept me safe. Now I know it only kept others comfortable. Heads nodded around the room. No anger. Just understanding. The lesson had settled in. The quiet rule was gone, but its shadow remained as a reminder. Not of failure, but of responsibility. People understood now that governance doesn't fail loudly at first. It fails softly, through shortcuts, assumptions, and unchallenged authority. And once people learn that, they don't unlearn it. I was asked if I felt victorious. The truth was more complicated. There was no moment of triumph. No single scene where everything clicked into place. Just a series of choices to keep looking when stopping would have been easier. That's usually how real change happens. Not dramatically. Persistently. The most powerful outcome wasn't refunds, resignations, or rewritten rules. It was confidence. People trusted themselves again. They trusted their right to ask, to see, to understand. And that confidence reshaped the community more than any policy ever could. New homeowners arrived and were told the story openly. Not as a warning, but as an inheritance. This is what happens when people stop asking questions, they were told. And this is what happens when they start again. Silence lost its mystery. It became something observable, explainable, preventable. Looking back, the quiet rule failed because it relied on one fragile belief, that no one would read closely enough to notice what was missing. It underestimated curiosity. It underestimated patience. And it underestimated how powerful ordinary people become once they realize authority must be proven, not assumed. The HOA still exists. Rules still exist. Disagreements still happen. But one thing is gone for good. The idea that silence equals legitimacy. That idea was dismantled, not by force, but by attention. And that's the real ending. Not exposure. Not revenge. But awareness. Because once people understand how silence is built, they stop mistaking it for peace. And when that happens, no quiet rule can ever erase a voice again.